In the spring of 2019, a family gathering in suburban Chicago took an unexpected turn when 8-year-old Ryan Henderson stood up during dinner and began performing an impromptu comedy routine. His parents, Michael and Lisa, had seen their son tell jokes before. Typical kid humor, knock-knock jokes, silly puns. But what happened that evening was different. Ryan's timing was impeccable. His delivery was sophisticated beyond his years. And his voice, as he slipped into character, carried an unmistakable raspy quality that made Lisa drop her fork. The cadence, the inflection, the way he built to a punchline, it was achingly familiar. Michael looked at his wife across the table. They were both thinking the same thing, though neither wanted to say it aloud. Their son sounded exactly like Robin Williams. Ryan had been obsessed with comedy for months, but this went beyond childhood fascination. He would pace the living room late at night, working through material with the intensity that seemed borrowed from another lifetime. He'd wake up remembering routines he'd never heard, jokes structured in ways that demonstrated a professional understanding of comedic architecture. When his parents asked where he'd learned these things, Ryan would pause, his young face creasing with confusion. "I just remember them," he'd say, "from before." Lisa Henderson was a public school teacher, practical by nature, skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or proven. But she couldn't ignore what she was witnessing. She began recording Ryan's performances on her phone. She documented the jokes, the impressions, the way he could shift between characters with fluid precision. She noted the specific voice modulations, the physicality, the emotional intelligence behind the humor. Then she did something that would change everything. She sent the recordings to Dr. James Matlock, a psychologist who had spent decades researching cases of past life memory in children. Dr. Matlock had investigated over 200 such cases during his career. He'd learned to distinguish between childhood imagination, exposure to media, and something more anomalous. Cases where children possessed specific, verifiable information they shouldn't know. When he watched the videos of Ryan, he saw patterns that intrigued him. The boy wasn't simply mimicking Robin Williams in the way a fan might. He was performing with an internal understanding of comedic construction that typically took years to develop. And there were the statements Ryan made between performances, unprompted observations about the nature of comedy, about connecting with audiences, about the loneliness that could exist behind laughter. The investigation began in earnest that summer. Dr. Matlock traveled to Chicago to meet Ryan in person. He brought with him a colleague, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a specialist in child psychology who could help ensure the interviews remained ethically sound and age-appropriate. They set up in the Hendersons' living room, cameras positioned discreetly, audio equipment testing clean. Ryan entered the room with characteristic energy, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation despite his young age. Dr. Matlock started with open-ended questions. He asked Ryan about his memories, about where these jokes came from, about what he remembered from before. Ryan settled into the couch, his posture relaxing in a way that seemed practiced, almost theatrical. He began to speak about a life in comedy, about starting young, about the pressure of performance. He described the feeling of being on stage, the particular quality of stage lights, the sound of an audience's laughter building. These weren't observations a child could easily fabricate. They were sensory memories, detailed and specific. Then Ryan said something that made both researchers lean forward. He described a specific comedy club in San Francisco, a small venue with a narrow stage and a brick wall behind it. He detailed the texture of the brick, the way sound bounced in that particular space, the smell of cigarette smoke that used to hang in the air. He mentioned performing there in the late 1970s, working on material, refining voices. Dr. Matlock made notes. The Holy City Zoo, a legendary San Francisco comedy club where Robin Williams had indeed performed regularly during that exact period. The venue had been instrumental in Williams' early development, but it wasn't well documented in mainstream sources. Finding information about its specific physical characteristics would require accessing archived materials or interviews with people who'd been there. Over the following weeks, the investigation deepened. Dr. Matlock constructed careful verification tests, mixing accurate historical details with plausible but incorrect information. He showed Ryan photographs of various comedy clubs, asking which ones felt familiar. Ryan consistently identified venues where Williams had performed while dismissing similar-looking spaces where he hadn't. When shown photographs of groups of comedians from the 1970s and 1980s, Ryan pointed to specific individuals, providing names and anecdotes about working with them. Some of these anecdotes aligned with documented accounts. Others were too obscure to immediately verify. The voice remained the most striking element. Ryan would slip into what his family called the other voice without apparent effort. It wasn't a conscious impression. He wasn't studying Williams' performances and copying them. The voice emerged naturally, particularly when he was relaxed or performing. Dr. Hernandez, who specialized in vocal development in children, noted that Ryan's vocal control was extraordinary. The raspiness, the particular rhythm of speech, the ability to modulate emotion through subtle tonal shifts. These weren't typical capabilities for an 8-year-old. Lisa Henderson wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to protect her son from the scrutiny this investigation would inevitably bring. But another part of her needed to understand what was happening. She began her own research, reading everything she could find about Robin Williams' life. She discovered details Ryan had mentioned months earlier, before she'd started paying close attention. Specific movies, particular routines, personal struggles with loneliness and depression. Her son had spoken about these things as memories, not as facts learned from books or documentaries. In September, Dr. Matlock arranged for Ryan to meet with several comedians who had worked with Robin Williams during different periods of his career. The meetings were structured as casual conversations, recorded but not formal interviews. The comedians were told only that Ryan was a young comedy enthusiast. They weren't informed about his claimed memories. What happened during these encounters added another layer to the investigation. Ryan connected with these performers in ways that startled them. He referenced obscure comedy techniques, discussed the evolution of stand-up in the 1970s with unexpected sophistication, and demonstrated an understanding of comedic timing that seemed instinctive rather than learned. One comedian, Mark Patterson, who'd performed regularly with Williams in the early 1980s, pulled Dr. Matlock aside after spending an hour with Ryan. "There's something about how he structures jokes," Patterson said. "It's not current comedy style. It's older. It's how he used to work." But perhaps most compelling was a moment that occurred spontaneously during one of these meetings. Ryan was joking with Patterson when he suddenly shifted into a bit about the absurdity of fame, about being recognized everywhere, about losing anonymity. His voice deepened, his energy changed, and he delivered a monologue that was simultaneously hilarious and melancholic. Patterson's expression shifted from amusement to something more complex. Recognition mixed with discomfort. "That's almost word for word something Robin said to me once," he told the researchers later. "We were sitting in a diner at 2 a.m. after a show. He was talking about what success costs. I never told anyone about that conversation." Dr. Matlock documented everything meticulously. He cataloged Ryan's statements, cross-referenced them with biographical information about Williams, and investigated which details could have been accessed through normal means versus which remained genuinely anomalous. The findings were complex. Some of Ryan's knowledge could potentially be explained through extensive exposure to Williams' work, movies, interviews, documentaries. But other elements resisted easy explanation. The sensory memories, the emotional understanding, the specific details about private moments and obscure venues. These suggested something more than simple information acquisition. The investigation also had to consider alternative explanations. Could Ryan be unconsciously absorbing information from his environment? Could his parents, despite their sincere denials, have inadvertently exposed him to extensive Williams material? Dr. Hernandez conducted separate interviews with Michael and Lisa, examining their media consumption, their interests, their knowledge of Williams' career. Neither parent had been particularly interested in Williams before Ryan's memories emerged. They owned none of his films. They hadn't discussed his life or death with their son. Yet here was Ryan, demonstrating knowledge that suggested intimate familiarity. As winter approached, The research team expanded their investigation. They brought in Dr. Eleanor Vance, a specialist in reincarnation research who had spent years studying similar cases. Dr. Vance had developed protocol for distinguishing between genuine past life memory cases and other phenomena. Cryptomnesia, fantasy, information acquired through normal but forgotten means. She spent weeks with Ryan, conducting detailed interviews, examining the structure and consistency of his memories, looking for patterns that appeared in verified reincarnation cases. What Dr. Vance found aligned with characteristics documented in other strong cases. Ryan's memories had emerged spontaneously around age 4, which matched the typical onset period. The memories were becoming more detailed and specific as he aged, another common pattern. He demonstrated emotional connections to the memories. He would become genuinely sad when discussing the isolation of fame, genuinely energized when talking about performing. These weren't descriptions of things he'd heard about. They were emotional memories, felt experiences. But Dr. Vance also noted complications. Reincarnation cases typically involved individuals who had died before the child was born. Robin Williams had died in August 2014. Ryan was born in November 2010. There was no overlap. Williams had been alive for Ryan's first 4 years. This didn't fit the standard pattern. It raised questions about the nature of consciousness, about when and how identity might transfer, about whether the phenomenon they were investigating even aligned with traditional reincarnation models. Ryan himself seemed remarkably unburdened by these metaphysical questions. To him, the memories were simply real. He didn't understand why adults found them so confusing or troubling. Sometimes he would look at his parents with genuine puzzlement when they pressed him about how he could remember these things. "I just do," he'd say, "the same way you remember being a kid. It's just there." By early 2020, Dr. Matlock had compiled an extensive case file. It included hours of recorded interviews, verification documents, analyses from multiple specialists, and testimony from people who had known Robin Williams. The evidence was compelling, but not conclusive. Science demanded replicability, objective measurement, falsifiable hypotheses. Consciousness and memory, particularly when dealing with claims of past life memory, resisted these requirements. What Matlock could say with certainty was that Ryan Henderson possessed knowledge and abilities that were difficult to explain through conventional means. Whether that knowledge derived from a genuine connection to Robin Williams' consciousness or from some other phenomenon remained uncertain. The case also raised ethical considerations. As Ryan's story became known within research circles, media interest intensified. Journalists wanted interviews. Documentary producers contacted the family. The Hendersons had to decide how much exposure was appropriate for their son. They chose to limit access, allowing only the research team to conduct formal investigations. They wanted to protect Ryan's childhood, to let him develop normally despite these extraordinary circumstances. Dr. Hernandez monitored Ryan's psychological well-being throughout the process. She watched for signs of dissociation, identity confusion, or distress. What she observed instead was a child who seemed comfortable with his dual sense of self. Ryan never claimed to be Robin Williams. He understood he was Ryan Henderson, but he also carried these other memories, these other experiences. He'd integrated them into his identity in a way that seemed healthy and balanced. He still played video games, still fought with his younger sister, still struggled with homework. The memories were part of him, but they didn't define him. As Ryan approached his 9th birthday, the memories began to shift. This, too, was consistent with documented reincarnation cases. Past life memories typically faded as children aged, their current life experiences gradually overwhelming earlier ones. Ryan still remembered the comedy clubs, the performances, the emotions, but the details were becoming less sharp, less immediately accessible. He had to work harder to recall specific information. Dr. Matlock documented this transition, noting how Ryan's relationship to the memories evolved as his current identity strengthened. In March 2020, the research team compiled their final report. It was careful, measured, acknowledging both the compelling evidence and the limitations of their investigation. They concluded that Ryan Henderson's case represented a significant anomaly worthy of serious scientific attention. They couldn't definitively prove past life memory, but they documented a phenomenon that resisted conventional explanation. The report would be published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, adding to the growing body of research into these mysterious cases. For the Henderson family, the investigation had been transformative. They'd entered it seeking answers and found instead a deepened sense of mystery about consciousness and identity. They'd watched their son work with researchers, had seen the evidence accumulate, had wrestled with questions that challenged their fundamental assumptions about how reality operates. Whether Ryan truly carried memories from Robin Williams' life, or whether something else entirely was occurring, they couldn't say with certainty. But they'd witnessed something extraordinary, and that witnessing had changed them. Ryan continues performing comedy. His style is evolving, incorporating his own experiences, his own observations of the world. The influence of those other memories remains, adding depth and complexity to his work. When he performs now, there are moments, brief flashes, when a voice emerges, when the timing becomes perfect, when something ancient and practiced shines through his young face. His parents watch from the audience, pride mixed with wonder, never quite certain what they're witnessing, but grateful for the mystery. Dr. Matlock still corresponds with the family, checking in periodically, documenting Ryan's development. He knows this case will remain controversial. Science is uncomfortable with phenomena that resist measurement and replication. But he also knows that dismissing something simply because it challenges our current understanding is the opposite of scientific thinking. The Ryan Henderson case, like the best consciousness research, asks us to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously, to remain open to mystery while demanding rigorous investigation, to acknowledge what we don't understand while refusing to abandon the tools of careful observation and analysis. The question of consciousness, of what we are, of whether identity persists beyond physical death, of how memory works, remains fundamentally open. Cases like Ryan's don't provide definitive answers, but they suggest the terrain is more complex than our current maps indicate. They invite us to look more carefully, to question our assumptions, to remain humble before the profound mystery of awareness itself. If you find yourself intrigued by these investigations into consciousness and the persistent mystery of past life phenomena, subscribe to this channel. We continue exploring cases where the boundaries of identity seem permeable, where memory defies conventional explanation, where the nature of who we are remains beautifully, provocatively uncertain. These stories ask us to think more deeply about the fundamental questions of existence. Join us as we investigate, document, and remain open to possibilities that challenge everything we think we know about consciousness and the continuation of identity beyond death.